Welcome to the Places and Profiles podcast, the podcast that explores the issues, stories, and people that have shaped places into what they are today. Here's your host, Adam Kamek.
If you're interested in starting a podcast, then Podcaster's Paradise is an invaluable resource for you. With step-by-step video tutorials, a tremendous number of resources and templates, and daily support, Podcaster's Paradise is by far the most important resource for any aspiring podcaster. Plus, if you join Podcaster's Paradise through my link, then I will promote your podcast on the show. Check out Podcaster's Paradise at placesandprofiles.com/paradise. Hi, everybody. On today's episode, I spoke with Jeremy Black about the British monarchy. Jeremy and I cover almost 1,000 years of history. We look at the key English and British monarchs over that time period, and we also take a look at some of the issues facing Britain in the present day and some of the issues related to Elizabeth II and King Charles III and the future of the British monarchy. I hope you'll enjoy listening to today's episode. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Places and Profiles podcast. Today I'm speaking with Jeremy Black about the history of the British monarchy and the role of the British monarchy today. Jeremy is a prolific lecturer and writer, and he is the author of over 100 books, including A Brief History of the British Monarchy. You can follow his work at jeremyblackhistorian.wordpress.com. For more information, please check out the show notes page for this episode at placesandprofiles.com/9. Jeremy, welcome to the show.
Hi.
Well, thank you so much for joining me.
I think podcasts are very important. I think they're one of the ways in which, as it were, previous and practices of historical awareness, which very much sort of located people in a very small set of institutions, have been just blown apart. So I think podcasts are very important in the democratization of knowledge.
Well, I concur with that opinion. It certainly allows for a much wider variety of topics and opinions to be covered with all sorts of levels of depth and insight that other forms of media may not allow. But anyways, today we are going to be covering a sweeping overview of the British monarchy and what that means for today. So let's just go ahead and get started at a natural starting place, and that is with the origins of the British monarchy. So where does this idea of having a monarch in Britain come about? Where can we trace the origins back to for this?
Well, I suppose for most political groups, you've always had a head, a sacral figure who's also had political authority. And that was the case with the tribes in pre-Roman British Isles. Obviously, the first, as it were, monarch who ruled a large chunk of Britain was, in fact, the Roman emperor. In other words, it was a monarchy by conquest, and that remained the case from roughly, the Romans came in 43 AD, so let's say roughly 50 till roughly 410. And that empire, that monarchy, ruled over what we would now present day call England, or most of England, apart from a very small bit at the top, and Wales. But what one tends to do when one's thinking of monarchy within Britain is to think of, as it were, indigenous monarchy. And there, of course, you have the collapse after the Romans into a number of different polities, most famously Wessex, Mercia, and Northumbria. You have unification in the 10th century. And it's from then on that you can really think of a monarchy ruling essentially England. And that then at different times has a wider sway.
Well, and then moving forward into the next century, the 11th century, that's when we get the Norman Conquest, and that's when we get William the Conqueror taking over and Harold II no longer being the monarch in Britain. So how was the Norman Conquest significant in shaping the British monarchy as we would come to know it in the ensuing centuries? And how was that just significant in changing the path of Britain in general?
Well, the Norman Conquest in 1066 means the end of the Anglo-Saxon Old English state. It means that England is going to be part of a bigger political entity, in which the key interests of the rulers are in modern-day France and French expansion. First of all, the Normans and then the Plantagenets. It doesn't preclude the development of monarchy in England, but it does mean that much of this monarchy, as it were, follows a pattern which to a degree looks to French patterns and French interests.
And how can we characterize William the Conqueror's rule as monarch? Because of all the British monarchs from the pre-Tudor period, from the earlier centuries of the British monarchy, he's certainly one of the better known British monarchs and one of the few that's kind of broken through internationally into the way that we view Britain in a historical context. So, in addition to leading the Norman conquest, what's significant about his time as monarch and his role in Britain?
Well, William I, whose years are 1066 to 1087, very much presented himself like an earlier 11th century conqueror, Canute of Denmark, in arguing that they were rightful rulers and that they'd taken over the majesty of English kingship. But in practice, they were experienced by those who didn't agree with them, which was a lot of the native English elite. They were experienced as rather brutal conquerors, particularly even more William the Conqueror, who did not respond to opposition in a particularly conciliatory fashion. So one way of looking at William the Conqueror and one way of looking at the establishment of monarchy under the Normans is brutal control. On the other hand, what was interesting is that the Normans fall out with themselves, and after, as it were, they've smashed up the native English elite, they spend most of the rest of their time fighting each other. And indeed, monarchy in England, as indeed separately in Scotland, monarchy in England becomes very much compromised by elite rivalries. So on the one hand, there is the idea of the monarch as having the figure of justice, the person who's there to protect the church, etc., etc. And on the other hand, there is the brutal reality that people oppose the monarch, rebel against them, and eventually murder them.
All right, now let's fast forward, and unfortunately, we're going to have to do some skipping around just because there have been so many monarchs over. Even if we just go back to William the Conqueror, that's almost 1,000 years, so we can't get to all of them. But we're going to fast forward into the 1200s, and King John, again, one of the more noteworthy earlier British monarchs, in large part because of the Magna Carta coming into existence during his time in power. So, what's the significance of King John's reign and then the Magna Carta starting to rein in some of the power of the British monarchy in 1215?
Yes, can I make it clear? A Scotsman would throw something at you because in 1215, Scotland's independent. So, I mean, it is. The monarch of England is the most important monarch simply because of the power of England within the British Isles, but is not running a state called Britain at that period. Magna Carta is an attempt to, as it were, entrench what is understood by many of the greater magnates as an appropriate relationship between the monarch and the law. And that therefore represents a limitation of authoritarian government. Now, the reality is, as with most systems of that type, legal systems of that type, ultimately it depends upon people being willing to act to stop monarchs who are seen as operating unfairly or illegitimately. And indeed, far from everybody, sort of clapping hands, the rest of John's reign sees a civil rebellion and civil war, and his successor and son, Henry III, who accepts Magna Carta, in turn faces a civil war. So one has to say that Magna Carta is more significant as aspiration than as something that sets a constitutional background for a peaceful nature of of political agreement.
Yes, and to your point about Scotland, that is a good correction to make. Thank you for correcting me, because from 1215 forward, it's going to be about 500 years until the Act of Union under Queen Anne, when Scotland is going to be incorporated with England and some entity covering the island of Great Britain is going to be formed. So
yes,
I certainly appreciate that correction.
Yeah, there's a personal union from 1603 when James VI of Scotland becomes James I. Under Edward I in the 1290s, there's an attempt to join the two, but that falls down. But the way to think about it for an American audience is to imagine you're a Canadian and you are being told that, as it were, America rules in Quebec and Montreal, Toronto, or Vancouver. You might not be tremendously happy about it.
Yeah, and during early American history, when Canada was still a British colony, there were some attempts at that, but that's a different topic for a different day. So you mentioned Edward the First there, so let's talk about him for a moment, because there were the attempts at personal union at incorporating Scotland. There are also efforts to expel Jews from England. What are some of the key things to know about Edward the First and his legacy?
Well, Edward I's legacy ultimately fails because he wants to unite England and Scotland, and it goes wrong. He wants to maintain the position of his family in France, and that gets compromised. And he's obliged to expand the power of Parliament and the regularity of Parliament in order to try and finance his wars with France and Scotland, which is a persistent pattern of English and then later British history. I would say that Edward I is also, I mean, you mentioned the expulsion of the Jews. Of course, anti-Semitism was quite common in the medieval period. One can see it in the Crown of France as well. What is interesting is that Edward regarded himself as a pious Christian. He went on the crusade, he went on pilgrimages. But of course, his notion of Christianity was, as was commonplace in that period, a authoritarian and violent one.
All right, so continuing on chronologically, we're going to skip a little bit of time and we're going to move to the mid 1400s when the War of the Roses breaks out. And this is going to last 32 years or so and ultimately end with the House of Tudor coming into power. What exactly happened during the War of the Roses? What were the key sides there, and how did that shape what became of the English monarchy?
But what I think one can point out is a combination of weaknesses on the part of individual monarchs, a difficulty in the monarchical system of coping when you have a weak monarch, rivalries between the broader royal strands of the broader royal family, and rivalries within the magnates, the greater aristocracy, washing over into these rivalries within the royal family. And what this persistently leads to, incidentally, is not just rebellion, but the murder of kings. Edward II is murdered, Richard II is murdered, Henry VI is murdered, Edward V is murdered, Richard III is killed in battle. So this is a brutal period. And if you go north to Scotland, you will also find that kings are being killed as well. So this is a brutal period. It is one in which, as it were, people wish to be monarchs. There is no republican sentiment at all, but monarchy itself is compromised by the weakness of individual monarchs.
All right, and then we get to the end of the War of the Roses, and Henry VII is going to be the King of England, beginning at that point. He's obviously overshadowed in popular culture in the way that we view British history, at least here in the US, by his successor and son, Henry VIII. But Henry VII has his own legacy of significance, where we see some centralization of power coming off the War of the Roses and a lot of concerns about his grip on power, about the Tudor control of power fading away in light of what had just happened with the War of the Roses. So what is Henry VII's legacy? What are some of the key things to know about his reign?
Well, Henry VII and his second son, but successor, Henry VIII, benefit enormously from the bloodletting among their potential rivals during the Wars of the Roses, and from judicious, or in the case of Henry VIII, extensive executions thereafter. I think it's fair to say that traditionally the Tudors were seen as a kind of new monarchy. In other words, end of Middle Ages, suddenly things change. There is another way to look at it and to say that they are successful medieval monarchs. I think that's another way to look at it, that actually the system that had been created and used not too badly under Henry I, under Henry II, under Edward I, and under Edward III actually comes more to fruition under the early Tudors.
Well, and then Henry VII passes away, and as you said, Henry VIII was his second son because his first son, Arthur, dies while Henry VII is still on the throne. So Henry VIII ascends to power, and he's in there for 38 years or so. In the U.S., he's probably best known for his six wives and the Broadway musical Six that has become prominent over the last few years, has helped with exploring the stories of the six wives of Henry VIII and kind of reestablishing that in a lot of people's minds as being one of the key characteristics of his rule. But there are a lot of other ways that Henry VIII's rule is significant in shaping England behind the goofiness with the six wives. Can you talk a little more about that, the breaking away from the Catholic Church and establishing the Church of England being probably chief among those? But what are some of the significant ways that Henry VIII changes the direction of the English monarchy during his 38 years in power?
Well, you're absolutely right that the Protestant succession and also the extent to which the Protestant succession is entrenched through Parliament, so a greater role for Parliament, are both important in terms of a particular English, what the Germans would call Sonderweg, path of development and political culture. But if I might just say something about the, as you put it, goofiness of the wives, a key element of any monarch is to provide for the succession. If you cannot provide for your succession, then you are threatening the entire stability, not only of your dynasty, your ruling family, but of the country as a whole. So this is the great problem. Wife number one, you have a woman that is not regarded as brilliant in that period, although it wasn't in any way illegal. Wife number two, exactly the same. Wife number three, you finally get a boy, but quite frankly, young, sickly, not brilliant, you want more. And wife number four and wife number five should have been able to provide more, but it doesn't work out. So in some respects, one can see the pursuit of women, not so much for sex, but for dynastic, consolidation. That, I think, is the key element. And that differs a bit from, say, his contemporary Francis I of France, who was much more in, pursuing women for sex. So I think there is a difference there. And it's a key element that we need to remember, that a monarchy is supposed to create its successor. Henry VIII doesn't do that. And indeed, his legacy is a fragile royal family, which ultimately in 1603 comes to the end of the direct line and produces another royal family, the Stuarts, taking over, which would not have been regarded as a success by Henry.
Well, and the War of the Roses had elements of succession crises as well. So it would have been very fresh on the mind of Henry VIII and of many in England that there could be issues related to succession should he not bear a suitable and healthy male heir to succeed him.
Absolutely.
All right, so Henry VIII dies, and you mentioned his sickly son, who is not going to last very long as king, but is going to be king for about 6 years, Edward VI, and then that gives way to Mary I, Bloody Mary, and that gives way to Elizabeth I. And while this is going on, there's this backdrop of changing religious ideas in England, where we mentioned that Henry VIII is going to have this split from the Catholic Church, the English Reformation, where England is going to become a Protestant country. In a lot of ways, that's further cemented by some of the advisors in the court of Edward VI. But then Mary I, it's going to snap back towards Catholicism. And then when we get to Elizabeth, England is going to finally be established as being a Protestant country. What does this turbulent time between the death of Henry VIII and Elizabeth I establishing herself as queen look like? And how does religion play a role in this time period?
Well, religion plays a significant role in the rebellions against first Edward particularly the Cornish Rebellion, and then against Mary, the Wyatt Rebellion, and then indeed against Elizabeth, the Northern Rebellion. And what it reminds us is that, as it were, the dynasty is fragile, and religion can help to, as it were, encourage people to feel that it is legitimate to oppose the monarch.
And Mary, of course, has this nickname Bloody Mary. So what brings that about? Because that is probably, outside of England, what she is best known for is that nickname Bloody Mary and the executions that went on under her reign.
Yes, well, under Mary, there's an attempt to have a pushback against Protestantism. This leads to the execution of prominent and indeed not prominent Protestants, and that is then understandably played up under the subsequent Protestants, particularly by saying that every church has to have a copy of John Foxe's Book of Martyrs, which provides a martyrology for the Protestants under Mary. And, this idea that Catholicism is equated with violence, which becomes an important part of the English, as it were, historical account.
All right, so then we get Elizabeth I. How significant is it that there was a female monarch of England at this time? How unusual would that have been in a global context when she's coming to power in 1558?
It's relatively unusual because only some countries had a inheritance of the throne by a woman or through a woman. I think actually in Elizabeth's case, it's also unusual in that she chooses not to marry. I mean, after all, her half-sister Mary, who's her predecessor, had married, and her husband, Philip II of Spain, saw this as the basis for a new, as it were, political situation. So, remember, Elizabeth is not unique. In fact, one of her opponents is Mary, Queen of Scots, who is a sovereign woman in Scotland. But it is unusual because under the system in those countries where female inheritance exists, a woman could only inherit if there wasn't if there wasn't any brother.
So Elizabeth is on the throne for a long time, from 1558 to 1603. And looking at this as an American from the outside, looking in, on the surface, it looks like some of the key accomplishments or key parts of the legacy of her reign would be England reestablishing itself as a Protestant country, the defeat of the Spanish Armada in the U.S., the beginning of colonization attempts in the Americas with the attempt at the Roanoke colony in present-day North Carolina. And then, of course, she ends up not marrying or having kids, so that's going to trigger a change in the royal family upon her death. But what are some of the key things to know? I should also add the cultural and literary developments that go on during her time in power with Shakespeare and this whole notion of an Elizabethan England that breaks through kind of the cultural zeitgeist as well. What are some of the key things to know about her legacy and her decades on the throne?
Well, I think it's fair to say that for both contemporaries and even more for those who came after, Elizabeth, partly by being linked with national survival against Spain, partly by being, as it were, a survivor, so that those people who'd grown up under a Catholic England were increasingly just dying off, Elizabeth comes to express and encapsulate an idea of a successful English monarchy. The practicality is the 1590s are a very difficult decade with social misery, economic problems, an intractable war, and political and religious rivalries. But often, as you know, it's how things appear in hindsight that is crucial. And the subsequent problems that James I, Charles I, Charles II, James II were to encounter made Elizabeth seem excellent.
So what are some of the ways that Elizabeth does seem excellent in hindsight when compared with her immediate successors?
To success. She's linked to success. The defeat of the Armada is a crucial one. In the 1620s, when the English go to war with Spain again, and indeed with France also, it's a dismal failure. This is very, very different from how 1588 is conceived of and presented in the 16th century, in the 17th century, and then in the 18th century. Indeed, you're an American, you might be interested to note that Sheridan in 1779 produces a play for the London stage at a time when Britain is menaced with invasion by the French and Spanish allies of the American rebels. And the play is a spoof, but the play within a play is about the Spanish Armada. The idea being, we should bring forward a play about the Armada because that's the touchstone, if you like, of a nation to look at, given the situation we're in. After 1805 and the victory at Trafalgar largely replaces the Spanish Armada. After 1940, the Battle of Britain and the Blitz largely replaces Trafalgar. So in each case, there is a national mythos, a national account, which is absolutely crucial to how people see the success, stability, fortitude of the country.
All right, so let's go back chronologically to the Stuart period, since we were comparing Elizabeth I with her successors a little bit there in James I and Charles I. So can you go into a little more detail about the reigns of James I and Charles I and some of the problems that occur during their times in
power? I don't
power?
want to go into too much detail because, as you've correctly said, I've done a history of the monarchy. I've also done a history of Britain and a history of England, so readers can read those. But I want to focus in particular on the monarchs. And what I would say is this: there is always a tension in hereditary monarchy between as it were, the establishment of a clear succession. And it was clearly the case that James I would be succeeded by Charles I. Charles I also had an older brother, but he'd also died. So there's no, problems in 1625 from that point of view. The difference, I would say, is this, that the other systems of monarchy around the world are ones in which there may not be a hereditary legitimacy, but there may well be what we might call meritocratic monarchy. A meritocratic monarchy takes two different forms, both very different to the British system. Form number one, somebody seizes power through their own efforts. Now, in the English case, that's Oliver Cromwell, who rises in the political crisis that follows the execution of Charles I in 1649 and eventually takes over. A French example would be Napoleon in 1799. The point about these individuals is they may or may not be meritorious, however we define it, but essentially their grasp of power rests on force. The alternative is some form of meritocratic monarchy in which you have a legitimating principle, and that is the American model. The idea being that you have an election for your head of state, and of course the Americans are by no means unique in this, and that represents the democratic will of the public, and that therefore deals with the problem of instability that you might have in a hereditary monarchy where you might be just served up somebody who isn't up to the job. That's the theory. And indeed, in the 17th century or the 18th century, people could see that theory because there were elective monarchies. There, for example, the Pope, the Doge of Venice, these were elected monarchs. The Holy Roman Emperor was an elected monarch. But the interesting point that one needs to bear in mind is an elected monarch might also be A, somebody who wasn't particularly up to it, and B, somebody who didn't accept the legitimacy of the other side winning. So that in a way, the hereditary monarchy, however limited it might be, and quite frankly, in 17th century Britain, it's overthrown twice, once in the person of Charles I, and once in the person of James II, who is also James VII of Scotland. However, nevertheless, monarchy keeps going. And again, there are one or two people who are Republicans, but very few. And it's a measure of the political crisis by the late 18th century, which is where we need to go now, that in the British world, and the British world includes the American colonies, it's a measure of the crisis that a lot of people in those colonies opt for a republic.
Well, and one issue I do want to go back to before we return to the late 18th century, but since you talked about concerns about stability in the monarchy, in what way does the Glorious Revolution factor into these concerns about stability in the monarchy?
Well, the Glorious Revolution, the overthrow of James II and VII, creates in effect, civil war between two rival dynasties. One, the monarchs in London, who are accepted by Parliament. So William III, who takes power in 1689, having invaded in 1688, he has no children. The inheritance is then taken up by Queen Anne, and then after she dies, she has lots of children, but none survive her, by the Hanoverians, whose right to the throne, they do have a dynastic claim, but it's a distant one, whose right to the throne is essentially that of parliamentary monarchy. They've been vested through a parliamentary act. The alternative is the main line of the Stuarts. So James II, then his son, who takes over in 1701, James III, otherwise known, and also he calls himself James the Eighth of Scotland, and then his older son, Charles Edward Stuart, Bonnie Prince Charlie, and then Charles Edward Stuart's younger son, Henry, Duke of York, who becomes Henry IX. Now, that is a cause of instability. But after the defeat of the Stuarts at the Battle of Culloden in 1746, the Stuart case, although there are legitimists who press it, is as inconsequential, even more inconsequential in some respects, than that of French monarchy today.
All right. Now, with your previous answer, we left off in the late 18th century, and you mentioned that there were calls for republicanism in British colonies, especially in what would become the United States. In what ways did those calls for republicanism change the trajectory of the monarchy back in Britain? You said there weren't really calls for republicanism so much in Britain itself, but what impacts did that still have on shaping the British monarchy moving forward from then?
I think that, first of all, you're absolutely right. There wasn't much republicanism in Britain during the American War of Independence. There is a degree more in response to the French Revolution and the radicalization of the French Revolution during the 1790s, which helps to lead to a degree of radicalization in Britain. But the majority of public opinion consolidates around nation, church, and crown. And in a way, I think it's fair to say that by the 1800s, George III is enjoying a considerable degree of popularity as a symbol of the nation. And, quite frankly, if you look at the alternative, it's Napoleon, who doesn't exactly look very benign. It's the same thing. I mean, I'll make it now. Americans may not wish to listen, in which case shut your ears. Wouldn't be the first time. But, there are obviously issues and problems for the British monarchy today. But the easiest way for somebody to, discuss this matter with a Republican is to say to a Republican, well, a British Republican, would you really like somebody like Donald Trump being created as our head of state? And most Brits wouldn't. I'm no way trying to affect the debate within the United States. But the same thing in the 1790s, 1800s. Given the alternative of radicals in France, or then subsequently of Napoleon, most Brits thought, well, they were better off with their own system of government.
If you're an aspiring podcaster, then joining Podcasters Paradise is an absolute must. Podcasters Paradise is a premium membership community that will help you create, grow, and monetize your podcast. With step-by-step video tutorials, resources, and templates, and daily support via the private Facebook group, Podcasters Paradise is the best place to learn how to be a successful podcaster. Joining Podcasters Paradise has helped me with my podcast in so many ways. It is truly a tremendous resource. Plus, as an added bonus, if you join Podcasters Paradise through my link, then after you launch your podcast, I will mention on my show and link to your podcast from placesandprofiles.com, as long as your podcast is not inappropriate and is not significantly opposed to my beliefs and values. Check out Podcasters Paradise and get started on your podcasting journey today by going to placesandprofiles.com/paradise. Again, that's placesandprofiles.com/paradise. Well, and moving into the 19th century, of course, Queen Victoria is queen for from 1837 to 1901. So we're looking at a 64-year period where she is on the throne. She dies, and then we get the Edwardian period ushered in. How does her legacy shape the British monarchy, and are there any difficulties in kind of recovering from her no longer being there after she passes in 1901?
Yes, again, that's an excellent question. I think it's fair to say that there is a system of volatility in Britain at the beginning of the 20th century. There is a sense of growing economic and imperial strain under the pressure of the rise of Germany, America, and Russia. There are anxieties about the Irish question. There are domestic issues of politics, the rise of Labour, female suffragette movement. And at the same time, you've got an ability of an ancien regime, old order, to adapt. And Britain had a period of adaptation with remarkably little domestic violence. There was, of course, some, but remarkably little domestic violence in the late 19th and early 20th century. And it's very difficult to know what would have happened had World War I not come along, because World War I from 1914 to 1918 hits the British system hard, hits imperial monarchy across the world very hard, and as it plays out in Ireland, leads to the end of the monarchical rule over the bulk of the island of Ireland. So I think it's fair to say that, to my mind, the principal crisis is not what happened prior to World War I, but the actual nature and consequences of World War I.
And I want to return to that in a moment. But just to address the period of time that Victoria was on the throne, during her time in power, we're going to see Britain and the Western world as a whole drastically change in character with the Industrial Revolution, where at the beginning of her reign in 1837, agrarian societies throughout the West are still extremely common. With Britain in many ways leading the charge, the West is going to, in many ways, become industrialized during those decades.
Can I just say, it's a mistake. I'm not saying you're making this mistake, but it is a mistake to imagine that economic progress is incompatible with a conservative political system. That's a sort of liberal left fallacy. And what's interesting is the way in which economic development, in Europe, the fastest developing economy is actually Germany by the late 19th, beginning of the 20th century. And there's no real strong Republican movement in Germany. The Hohenzollern dynasty would have gone on ruling if they hadn't been so bloody stupid as to launch a war in the West in 1914 in support of their Austrian allies. So I myself would argue in favor of contingency. You've got to bear it in mind. Political analysts like Karl Marx got it totally wrong. Working class people were quite happy to go along with supporting established interests and, adapting to them and benefiting from them, just as many of them, not all of them, were also religious. So the idea which you saw among intellectuals that there would be necessarily a tension between economic change and, a matter like monarchy. No, I don't think that. And you can see the same thing today. At the present moment, the most powerful monarch in the world at the moment is President Xi, who runs a country which is the second largest economy in the world. And, you might not call him a monarch, but that's exactly what he is.
Yes, and I was not trying to make any connection between the system of government and economic development. I was more just commenting that during the extensive period of time during which Victoria was the queen, that the Industrial Revolution is in many ways going to take shape and transform much of the West. That does not necessarily have any connection
No, I
to
think you're right.
the system
And
of
also,
government.
of course, Britain became, I'm not saying this is good or bad, Britain became the major imperial power. And under Victoria, the British monarchy acquires an imperial status, the Empire of India. And there is some resistance in some places, sometimes quite violent. And in some cases, empire expands by a process of brutal conquest. But in others, it doesn't. And what is striking is how far empire and most of the imperial populations, again, accommodate themselves, which is not surprising in a way because they'd not exactly been ruled by democracies beforehand. I mean, if you think about it, in India, they swap the Mughal emperor for the British emperor. The British emperor is actually probably more law-abiding and less brutal and less corrupt than the Indian predecessor.
Now, earlier you mentioned World War One and the impact that that would have on the British monarchy, and of course, the ruling family is going to have a name change, in large part because of anti-German sentiment during World War One, where it's going to go from Saxe-Coburg and Gotha to being the House of Windsor, as we know that family today. What are some of the other ways, though, that World War One really shaped and altered the British monarchy?
Well, I think in World War One, again, you see a very close association between monarchy and war effort. You'd seen that with George III. George III personally didn't serve, but lots of his sons did. And in fact, his second son, the Duke of York, was in effect head of the army. George V very much associates himself with the war effort. And in a constitutional fashion. I mean, he doesn't seize power or anything, but there is very much a public display of the monarchy as in a sense, a militarized monarchy, which has remained the pattern to a considerable extent to this day, often wearing uniform, often serving in junior capacities in the armed forces. That's very much been the case. It's not something you would have associated, for example, with Edward VII, but it is something, or with George IV, but it is something you associated with George V, again, a second son who'd been in the Navy for a long time and much of whose affections were for the Navy in some respects.
All right, and before we move towards the members of the royal family that are alive today, or in the case of Elizabeth II, have been alive in the last couple of years, I do want to talk about one event from the interwar period that is sort of a curiosity in many ways to Americans and people that are again looking on from the outside in towards Britain, and that's in 1936, where the abdication of Edward VIII occurs because he's interested in marrying the American Wallis Simpson, and then is succeeded by his brother George VI. How did the abdication of Edward VIII alter the British monarchy, and what's the significance of that event?
Well, I think that's, again, a very interesting question. I think the key element is that Edward VIII, as it were, abdicated rather than going off into exile and then claiming to be the rightful monarch. That would, I think, have been a very different scenario. I mean, Edward VIII, as Duke of Windsor, was a nuisance, but he wasn't the centre of a legitimist cause. In long-term consequences, not much. I think with George VI and then with Elizabeth II, you very much see monarchs who cleave to what the politicians want, and in a way, Edward VIII, sort of being jockeyed out, must have encouraged that. But he was, in hindsight, and I think at the time understood to be, a man who was rather weak, and the fact that he couldn't keep his zip done up and that he didn't secure the succession didn't exactly speak in his favour.
All right, so let's turn to the longest serving British monarch and the British monarch that many people who are alive today, I guess everyone who's alive today, would be most familiar with, at least in terms of duration of their time as the monarch during their lifetime. And that's Elizabeth II from 1952 up until last year, 2022, serving as Queen of England or Queen of the UK. And obviously, a lot happens during her time in power or during her time on the throne. There are a lot of former British colonies that are going to gain their independence during this time period, and the lands over which she is queen are going to decrease in quantity during her time on the throne. But she also, at least looking at this as an American, seems to have been during her lifetime and even today, after her passing, a very popular figure who kind of rose above the way that we might look at a traditional politician in terms of popularity and respect and prestige. And it seems like she really, in a lot of ways, strengthened the prestige and reputation and support for the monarchy.
Well, the last, definitely, without a doubt. And I think also, there were periods when she was more or less popular. But I think in terms of respect for her, that was pretty consistent. And I think separate to that, affection for her became a lot stronger. So I think that she was somebody who, you contrasted her with politicians. I think she was seen as a figure of great integrity. And unfortunately, a number of politicians compromised that or didn't appear competent. So I think it's fair to say that the only politicians of her reign that really had very strong status, whether people agreed with their politics or not was another matter, was Sir Winston Churchill, who, of course, retired as Prime Minister in 1955, and then Margaret Thatcher, who was Prime Minister from 79 to 90. Obviously, a lot of people didn't agree with Margaret Thatcher, but she was generally regarded as believing what she said and as a figure of, quite stature. Whereas, for example, Mr. Blair, Tony Blair, who came into power in 1997, discredited himself by being seen as a liar, particularly over foreign policy. And the contrast between him, or later Boris Johnson, who was seen as a buffoon, the contrast between them and the Queen was very, very striking.
What did the level of pushback towards the monarchy and support for republicanism look like during sort of the later decades of Elizabeth II's reign into the present day? Because in the US, there is some coverage of British Republicans, and there's a perception, I guess, that maybe support for the monarchy has decreased a little bit, although still popular, that support for British republicanism maybe is on the uptick. Is that an accurate assessment, or is that completely incorrect?
Well, I think it is an accurate assessment, but there's two separate issues here. A, the nature and the extent of the support, which I don't disagree with you on. But secondly, how exactly would it work? I mean, how exactly would you turn the country into a republic? I mean, let's just put it like this. A recent experience with a referendum in 2016 is not one that is likely to encourage other, political leaders to go for a referendum. And I can't quite see how you could just legislate monarchy out. I mean, I suppose it was done in the aftermath of civil war in the 1640s, but I can't quite see how that would happen today. So whereas I think there is no doubt that there will be an increase in republicanism within parts of the former empire where the monarch is head of state, and you can see the mechanism there. I'm not quite sure that one can see the same mechanism in Britain, but I may be wrong. And anyway, I'm going to be dead by then, so it's not my problem.
Well, there does seem to be efforts towards republicanism in other Commonwealth realms where Charles III is the head of state. This seems to be a conversation in Australia and Canada and New Zealand to varying degrees
Yes,
as well.
I think, first of all, it's up to them. It's completely up to them. And as the king has made clear, he would want a good relationship, whatever is the nature of the constitutional position. And remember, all those three countries, if they did become republics, plan to remain in the Commonwealth, and the Commonwealth would, keep links going with Britain. So I don't think, it's not an issue for the British. They wish well to the Australians, they wish well to the Canadians, they wish well to the New Zealanders, but fundamentally it's up to them. I think in all cases there is endlessly this problem of, well, what do you replace it with? And some places have had great success with presidents who've not been partisan figures, who have been individuals much respected, seen as observing and maintaining the law, seen as, good custodians of the nation and of its armed forces in particular. And then there are others where, quite frankly, that isn't true. Now, in my view, Australia, New Zealand, and Canada, as mature political cultures, would make a success of being republics. So I think, it would work for them, and I wish them well. But that's not up to me. And there are, some countries where, quite frankly, they'd be probably better off in a different system. But again, that's not up to me.
Well, I think Barbados just underwent within the last couple of years.
It did indeed.
Yes, a transition away from the monarchy to a republic. Two quick questions for you, and then we'll wrap up for today. But I want to go back to the 1990s, and I figure that is very prominent when Americans think about the royal family, who, of course, is no longer with us, is Princess Diana. And there were controversies and scandals, and she got divorced, and then she died in a car crash in 1997. In what ways did her divorce from then Prince Charles and her later death tragically in 97 affect the British monarchy and the trajectory of the British monarchy?
Well, I think in the short term, I think it was a personal disaster for those individuals concerned, and a cause of great sadness to many people. And obviously, in terms of the reputation of the monarchy, didn't do it any good. In the longer term, I think it was irrelevant. I don't think, and in fact, it's very interesting that a lot of people, a lot of commentators said, oh, well, there'll never be a Queen Camilla, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The country wouldn't like it. Absolute rubbish. And she's a very popular Queen Consort at the moment. So, it's rather like the Meghan and Harry story. It makes for newspaper columns, but actually, you can live months here without a single person in any conversation mentioning the two of them.
All right. And the last question for you before we conclude for today. We mentioned earlier how after Victoria's death, when there was the transition to the Edwardian period, in some ways it was a significant change in Britain since Victoria had been on the throne for so long. A comparison could be made since Elizabeth II was queen for 70 years and such a beloved figure in so many ways that she's no longer with us. We're transitioning or have transitioned over the last year to King Charles III being on the British throne. In what way does Charles III becoming king and Elizabeth II no longer being the monarch, how is that going to change the British monarchy and the role and perception of the royal family in the UK?
Well, that's, again, an excellent question. First of all, it's generally agreed that the king has had a very good first year. And some people have been so grand as to say he's done better than they expected. Well, which I think is a very interesting way of judging their respective importance. I think it's fair to say that Britain is in a period of acute transition, but I wouldn't say the change of monarch is the most obvious one. There are very significant social, economic, political, and cultural strains. I think the way in which the transition from one monarch to another occurred last year without trauma and without significant difficulty actually was very good, but that actually cut across what is so significant, which is that so many other things aren't working. The monarchy appears to be working quite well at the present moment. Much of British society and state, that isn't exactly how one would talk about it. But then on the other hand, your elected monarchy isn't working brilliantly at the moment either.
That's a very mild way of putting it. I suppose one more question for you, even though I said that the last one would be the last question. But since Charles III became king in his 70s, it would be realistic to assume that his son is going to be king. William is going to be king for far longer than Charles will, just given the age at which Charles became king and the age potentially at which William would become king. Does Charles's more advanced age upon ascending to the throne, does that affect the way that that the British view his time on the throne and view William at all?
Well, first of all, can I just say, I mean, and the same thing. I mean, look, you're an American. You know that Americans don't sit down one morning and say, right, chaps and ladies and everything else we want to say.
Of course.
What do we think about Venezuela?
No, of course.
So there isn't a concerted British view. But if you're asking me for how I think it is shaping up, first of all, contingencies play an enormous role. Who knows what is going to happen in a world of chaos, terrorism, etc., etc. But if one assumes a benign outcome, which is what I hope that would happen, the king seems to be doing well. He seems to be happy in his role. He seems to be getting on well with people that meet him, and he's a very effective head of state. We're lucky we're in that position because we may well be having significant disruption in domestic politics in the next few years. It's too early to say what will happen after that, but I see no reason to anticipate any particular change. Scottish nationalism, which may have led in a different direction for Scotland, is not doing terribly well. And if Northern Ireland wishes to join the Republic, fine. It's not exactly a matter of particular significance in England or Scotland. And if that means that Northern Ireland ceases to be part of, the United Kingdom and then becomes part of a bigger republic, again, fine. It's not exactly anything that people are particularly worried about outside Northern Ireland. So I would say not something at the present moment. We've got many other things to worry about, very many other things to worry about here. But it is interesting, and what I think is important is it underlines, whether you're looking at Britain, whether you're looking at the United States, whether you're looking at other hereditary monarchical systems, say Japan or Sweden, whether you're looking at, in practice, monarchical systems which are hereditary, North Korea or Syria, for example, or Gabon, whether you're looking at ones which are very much one individual, whichever type you are looking at, what is abundantly clear is issues of legitimacy, purpose, and cohesion are difficult. The British system appears quaint to outsiders because of the ceremonial that it exists with, and also because it's been lasting for so long. And in many respects, it might not appear functional. But it does function, and at the present moment, it is fit for purpose, and that's good. And the fact that on top of that, it enjoys considerable affection means that it's part of the cohesion of a country that is desperately short of it.
All right. Well, that seems like a good place to end. Before we completely conclude this conversation, I mentioned in the introduction some places to follow your work. Can you run through that very quickly? Any books or websites or recommended readings?
Yes, I can.
Where you
I don't honestly remember my website number thing, but people can look it up. And on the website, they will find all sorts of free material in terms of at least 100 podcasts and many other, things that you just press on and they can read on all sorts of things, on strategy, on politics, on all sorts of things. As far as publications are concerned, it doesn't make me a better person, and it may be a crime to trees, but I reckon, I don't count them anymore, I reckon I've published about 185 books, which is, again, it doesn't make me good, a world record for historians. And I think there would be plenty there for people who are interested in all branches of history and at many different levels. So, I wish well to people, and there's plenty there to keep you off the streets. And on a wet Wednesday afternoon in Wyoming, why not read a book?
All right, fantastic. I want to remind everybody that the show notes page for this episode is placesandprofiles.com/9. And some of Jeremy's work, his website, jeremyblackhistorian.wordpress.com, a brief history of the British monarchy, which is one of his books, a couple of his other books that he mentioned earlier in this conversation will be linked there. So placesandprofiles.com/9 is the show notes page for today's episode. And Jeremy, thank you so much for your generosity with your time and for coming on the show and speaking with me today. I greatly appreciate it.
Thank you. And all the very best to my friends in the States. And for those people who are interested, I'm lecturing in December in Shreveport and in New Orleans.
Okay. Well, I live in Houston, so it's not crazy far. So maybe I'll fit that into my schedule and come and check that out. That sounds great. Thank you so much again for joining me today.
Okay. Cheers then.
Thank you for listening to today's episode of the Places and Profiles podcast. Please visit placesandprofiles.com to subscribe and listen to more episodes. Come back again soon, and thanks for listening.